All right. Well, in the interest of time, I know that we're still going to have more people join us. But I wanted to welcome you all. You all know I'm Jen, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. And I don't know, many of you folks may not be familiar with the National Council of State Legislatures, but I think they do really great work in tracking legislation and working with lawmakers across the states. And I had the privilege of seeing Katy present at the conference for the elections officials here in Ohio. And I thought that it was really helpful to kind of put into context what's happening here in Ohio in terms of legislation or what has happened and what we may see this next legislative term, which just started in January. And with that, I want to welcome Katy and ask you to start. But I don't remember if you have this in your slides or not, but if you could tell folks a little bit about NCSL, I would be really grateful.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And you did say you can see the presentation, right? Just okay, all set. Great. Well, yeah, I'm Katy Owens Hubler. I am the Associate Director of the Elections and Redistricting team at NCSL. So NCSL, we're the National Conference of State Legislatures. We serve the nation's 7,386 legislators and more than 25,000 legislative staff. So those are our primary constituents. And I will talk a little bit about some of the things that we do. We focus on policy research. So
Katy,
what I
just want to interrupt you for a second. I'm sorry. We're actually not able to see your screen.
Oh, okay. Let me try it again. I wonder if it, here we go. Are you
Perfect.
seeing it now?
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Do you see my notes too, or are you just seeing the presentation?
Nope, just your notes. You're safe.
Perfect. Thank you. Sometimes switching through Zoom and Teams, I never remember which is which. So if we're all set now, so yeah, NCSL, we cover a wide variety of policy topics. So I cover election administration, but my colleagues cover basically anything you can think of, from education to health, all different angles of legislation across the country. We also provide connections. So we connect legislators to each other and across the aisle, and ways of kind of meeting and talking about different policy areas. We provide training opportunities for legislators and legislative staff. So that's kind of the professional development angle. That's one of the ways that we strengthen legislatures. We also are a state voice in DC. So if there are things that are happening in DC that we think will affect the states, we do have a branch based in DC that can kind of advocate on behalf of the states if necessary. And we have a series of meetings throughout the year. Our big one is the Big Legislative Summit, and that's taking place in Boston in August this year. But we have a series of other meetings throughout the year as well, again, with that aim of connecting legislators to each other. So as Jen mentioned, I was asked to originally give this presentation for the Ohio Association of Election Officials. And so I focused it real specifically on what you're looking at here in Ohio, but kind of putting that into a national perspective. So something that I always like to discuss first is how different election administration offices are structured throughout the country. Elections are very decentralized, and so every state does it a little bit differently. So to put this in context, in Ohio, you actually have the most common state level official, which is an elected Secretary of State. There are 33 other states that have a Secretary of State in this role. There are a few of those that are appointed as opposed to elected. And there are some states that have boards of elections or something similar. And then there are also some that have another elected official as the role of state election official. So for instance, lieutenant governor. At the local level, Ohio is actually a little bit different than most other states. You have that county board of elections with an appointed director. And so you're similar to 7 other states that sort of have a similar structure to that. There are many other states that have one individual as an elected county official who's in charge of elections in the county. So that's actually the most common structure at the county level. And then you have a number of states that are divided between those. So they've got multiple individuals or multiple boards that are in charge of elections ultimately. You've got 88 jurisdictions. So those are your counties that run elections. That varies throughout the country as well. Delaware, for example, is actually very centralized. There are only 3 counties in Delaware. Most things are actually done at the state level. And then you just have those 3 other counties that have some jurisdiction over elections. And the most decentralized is Wisconsin, with more than 1,800 different election offices. That's because elections are run at the very local level. So they're run at the municipal level and at the township level in Wisconsin. That's why there's so many of those. Ohio is also unique in that there is a state association that's quite strong. So this is fairly unique throughout the states. There are a few other states that have a similar structure, but Ohio in particular has an older association, a very strong association. You've got an executive director, which is actually not common for associations throughout the country. And you have a legislative committee who is very active in working with the legislature. And so that's something that's fairly unique to Ohio. You've got that very strong state association.
And I just want to jump in here. So friends,
Sure.
we've heard from Aaron Ackerman, that's the Ohio Association of Elections Officials. He comes and presents sometimes. They are actually all visiting lawmakers right now today, which is why we didn't have Aaron or someone else join us today. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so they're a pretty strong kind of unified voice, which is, again, there are some other states that have something similar, but Ohio is a particularly strong one. And Aaron Ackerman is wonderful too. So he's part of the reason that that is such a strong unified association and a voice in the state legislature. So just shifting over then to talk a little bit about legislation over the years. So I've been tracking election legislation for about 10 years. NCSL's tracking goes back to 2011. And actually we've got an archive database that goes all the way back to 2001, tracking election legislation database. Most of the years we've seen about 2,200 to 2,500 pieces of legislation introduced. You'll see here that there's a jump. That was in 2021. We tracked a lot of legislation that year. So more than 3,600 bills related to election legislation. And of course, that was partly due to responses to the pandemic and how voting changed during the pandemic, and then kind of reverting back to the status quo after the pandemic. It was also in reaction to a lot of the things that were happening on the national stage that year. So 2021, we saw that high point of introductions. I should note, though, that actually enactments, that's that bottom blue line there, those have actually stayed relatively steady. And so even though we saw a lot of bills introduced, we didn't necessarily see that many more enacted in 2021. It is also interesting to see those sort of mountains and valleys that have existed in recent years. Those didn't used to be so pronounced. So lately we've seen this huge jump in number of bills introduced in odd years and then kind of a lower point in even years. And that's tracking to be true this year as well. So I have this going up to 2024, and you'll see there was kind of a trending downward again in an even year. We're going to jump back up in 2025. We're already tracking 1,800 election-related bills, and it's only the middle of February. Most states are in session now, but we will see more bills throughout the year. So I anticipate it's going to be pretty high again this year as well. So now to some kind of specific hot topics. And again, I introduced these in the frame of, I know these are things that Ohio has considered in recent years. I haven't seen much Ohio legislation yet. So maybe you know of some things that are percolating, but just haven't quite been introduced yet. But these are some things that I know have been in the sort of popular imagination and hot topics around the country this year. One is returning absentee or mailed ballots. So I'll talk about this in the context of kind of how they're returned, who can return them, that sort of thing. Verification of citizenship. This is the biggest topic across the country this year. And I know this is something that Ohio is considered as well, so I'll touch on that. How ballots are counted, that relates to the actual tabulation, the machinery around how ballots are counted. And then ranked choice voting is something you've considered here in Ohio. That's been big around the country as well. And since 2020, we've seen an increase in legislation protecting election officials. So to get into these, the first one I'll talk about is those methods of returning absentee or mailed ballots. So I'll touch on drop boxes, ballot collection, which is somebody collecting ballots on behalf of somebody else and turning them in, and then how those mailed ballots or absentee ballots are verified. So first, ballot drop boxes. So these have been around for a long time, particularly in those states that mail ballots to all active registered voters. So Oregon has done that since the early 2000s, for example. But we did see an uptick in their use, particularly during the pandemic. And we've also seen a lot of states taking action on one way or another in terms of allowing drop boxes, prohibiting drop boxes, some of the security around them, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. In terms of their use, 2022 is the latest year that we have data for. We don't quite have 2024 data yet. So something of interest here is that there was an uptick in the usage of drop boxes in 2020. That's not surprising because of the pandemic. That was one method that people could return mailed ballots. They could also return them to election offices, at polling places. Interestingly, the number of people that mailed their absentee or mail ballots back actually dipped in 2020. And if you'll remember, that's partly because of a lot of the rhetoric around the post office at that time. So a lot of ballots were returned kind of in person as opposed to mailed back in 2020. And then in 2022, we saw an uptick, really a reversion to the mean. If you kind of draw a line between 2016 to 2022, you'll see that that was more of a trend. 2020 was kind of an aberration in a lot of ways. But we have seen a lot more states using drop boxes. In 2022, they were used in 39 states. There were a total of 13,000 drop boxes across the country. 11.5 million ballots returned via Dropbox, which was 40% of mailed ballots and 20% of all mail ballots cast. So drop boxes, they're one of those things that are unlikely to go away. So we'll continue to see legislation both prohibiting and permitting them in all likelihood. So in terms of the legal landscape right now, there are 28 states and DC that explicitly permit ballot drop boxes in statute. There are 12 states that explicitly prohibit them. And that's somewhat new. There weren't typically states that said, no, you may not use them in the past. So this is something that we're starting to see is prohibiting drop boxes. Often they're not explicit. So they don't say, you shall not use drop boxes. More often there are explicit ways that ballots may be returned and drop boxes are left out of that list. And then there are a number of states in gray there where they are silent in statute. So some counties may be using drop boxes, others may not in those states that are in gray there. So something that's been of interest in particular is some of the security features around drop boxes. And this is partly in reaction to in 2024, we did see a couple of incidences where there was an incendiary device put to drop boxes that happened in both Oregon and Washington. I should note that there are a variety of different ways to kind of ensure the security of drop boxes. In both of those states, they don't actually require video surveillance of drop boxes. There was video surveillance just from peripheral buildings and sort of police cameras. And so there is footage of those incendiary devices being put on the drop boxes, but video monitoring was not required in those states. So Ohio does require video surveillance at all times on drop boxes, and that's also true in a number of other states. There are also some states that kind of provide some flexibility around that. So in California, for example, they don't require it to be under video surveillance, but it has to be secure, accessible, and locked. And in Hawaii, it must be securely maintained. There are some more rural locations that really may struggle to put something under video surveillance, and there's a cost associated with it. So in a lot of places, they leave it up to the counties to determine what the security features of that drop box are. Florida recently has actually moved to requiring that they be monitored in person. And Georgia has something similar where they have to be under constant surveillance by an election official or other designee. And then they're almost always required to be secured to the ground in some way. So you couldn't just like drive off with the drop box, for instance, or drive a car into it and take that drop box out. Something that we've seen recently too, because of the incendiary devices that were used on a couple of these, is that drop boxes typically do have fire suppression systems. I think that was something that was not commonly known until those incidences happened, but they almost always do have some sort of fire suppression. Now, whether that fire suppression system is, if it's liquid, it may have the same effect of destroying the ballots. There are sort of dry fire suppression systems that are available too. Again, all of this costs money, so it's a consideration around securing those drop boxes. I know something in Ohio that's been of interest lately is where you put those drop boxes and kind of how they're distributed. So in Ohio, the requirement is not more than one outside a county board of elections. And that's a less common way of doing it. It's more common to kind of put a floor than a ceiling. But there are some similar states. So for instance, in Iowa, there's not more than one per county. Delaware, there's one at each election office. Again, they just got the 3. Georgia has kind of a floor and a ceiling. So there's at least one per county, and you may have more, but only totaling the lesser of 1 per 100,000 active registered voters or the number of early voting locations. And both Kentucky and Nebraska require at least 1 per county. Now, a lot of the states that have mailed ballots sent out to all active registered voters have requirements that they be geographically distributed. So for instance, California, Colorado, and Washington are like that, and that's based on population. So in Colorado, you have to have at least one for every 30,000 registered voters, for example. And then there's often distribution requirements too. In Washington, you have to have them on Native American reservations, for example. And then in some places you have to have one per municipality, and some it's one per polling location or early voting location. And then a couple of states kind of let the county officials determine that number and location as well. And then on the topic of ballot collection, so we categorize this as someone dropping off a ballot on behalf of another voter. And so there's a variety of requirements on this. Most states do allow this in some form or another. Sometimes they'll limit the number though. So for example, in Arkansas, somebody can only drop off 2 ballots per election for somebody else. In Colorado, they say no more than 10. In Minnesota, it's no more than 3. So you often can return a ballot on behalf of somebody else, but there are often limits to how that ballot, the sort of collection mechanisms. And there are some states that specify that only a family member, household member, or caregiver can return that ballot. And also a handful of states that designate somebody must do it, but sort of there has to be some way of designating it. So maybe there's something on the envelope, for example, that designates that individual can return it.
Real quick question.
Yeah.
Going back to the last slide, out of those states, how many have a form that the person bringing the ballot back have to fill out?
So that's not very common, but it's also not unheard of. So there are a handful. I don't have a number off the top of my head, but there are some states that have it. I've seen one example in Texas, for example, that they put the form on the actual envelope. So someone can fill out that section of the envelope and say, I'm returning this ballot on behalf of this individual or these 7 individuals. Okay, and then so verifying absentee mail ballots, that's also something I know Ohio is considering. So it's fairly common for states to conduct signature verification. So a total of 31 states do that. In Ohio, there's signature verification and a requirement that voters provide driver's license or state ID. So that's a little bit sort of that extra layer of security that only a handful of other states provide. But some states do have some other requirements on top of that. So there's 7 states that require the signature of a witness. There's 3 states that require it to be notarized, and a couple of states do require a copy of ID as well. And I'll pause there, Jen. I don't know if you have any other questions before I kind of move on off of the absentee and mail ballots.
Yeah, how many of the 39 states have multiple drop boxes per county?
Multiple of the 39 states that have. So there's quite a few that leave some kind of leeway for the counties to decide how many drop boxes are required. And then there's the states that have that distribution requirement. So it really depends on the size of the county. So for instance, I'm based here in Colorado, and Denver has probably 40 different drop boxes because we're in a metropolitan area and there's that population requirement. Whereas there are smaller counties throughout the state that may only have one because they have a smaller population.
That's great. And another question is that, are there any states that also look at miles traveled? Because I think here in Ohio, the county boards that would really like to have multiple drop boxes, some of them are very populous. Some of them are very rural. It's just that folks would have to drive really far.
Yeah, so Washington is one that comes to mind where they do have sort of geographic distribution requirements, and actually Colorado as well. It's not exactly the miles traveled necessarily, I think, but there is kind of a distribution requirement so that you're getting different communities. Utah is another one, so they require one per municipality. So they have a requirement that mailed ballots be sent out to all active registered voters. And if you just had one per county, there are some very geographically large counties that would make it very difficult for someone to travel to that location. So that's why they have that requirement, the one per municipality. So that actually allows, if you have a community that's really pretty isolated from the county seat, that allows that drop box to be in that community and not have the voters travel all the way to the county seat. So the hot topic of the year so far really is verifying citizenship, and that's verifying citizenship at the point of registration. So this is something that has been sort of a slow moving trend is what I would say. It really kind of came to a head in 2024 in the number of ballot measures that were on the ballot, and then the fact that every single one of them was approved. So there were 8 states that had it on their ballot. Every single one of those states approved it, and usually by pretty large margins. So what this is a state constitutional amendment saying that only citizens can vote. So everywhere across the country, only citizens are permitted to vote, are qualified to vote. But most of the time in state constitutions, it lists eligibility requirements, and one of the eligibility requirements is to be a citizen. What these amendments did is made it very explicit that only citizens may vote. And so that passed in quite a few states in 2024. And then it's also been the largest thing that we've been seeing in legislation so far this year. More than 30 states have something requiring citizenship verification or documentary proof of citizenship to vote on in legislation this year. But there are already 8 states that have this in law. There are a number that this dates back from pretty far. Arizona was the first. It was in about 2004 to have that requirement that documentary proof of citizenship was required when registering. And then a couple of other states over the years. There were 3 that just passed it in 2024. So now we're up to a total of 8 states that have this requirement in their law that you must show proof of citizenship at the point of registration. And then there's a number of other ways that states kind of will look at citizenship and verify citizenship. So there's, once you're already on the rolls, sometimes non-citizens do inadvertently get on the rolls. And so states take a variety of different tactics to sort of identify them at that point. So one way is to look at the number of people that have been excused from jury duty. So if someone says, no, I'm not a citizen, I don't qualify for jury duty, getting those lists of people. There's also a SAVE database that's run by the Department of Homeland Security. It's a 1-by-1 check. So if you are able to say, hey, I think this person may be a non-citizen, something indicates that they may be a non-citizen, then you can often go into the SAVE database and verify maybe they're in the process of being naturalized, maybe they've already been naturalized, or kind of do a 1-by-1 check about whether or not that person is in fact a citizen at this point. And there are possible audits of voting rolls that are possible as well. So that's looking back at the voting rolls and comparing different lists to try to identify potential non-citizens that have gotten on the rolls. So I know this is something that Ohio has been considering as well, but I will say is also the largest, sort of the most extensive trend across the country right now. I'll pause there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm sorry I'm hoarse today, guys, but Ohio's been running against the SAVE database. So can you just explain a little bit more? And remember, there's SAVE Act. That's not what we're talking about. This is the SAVE database. A little bit more what that database was designed for, Katie. And when you into one check, how it wasn't really designed for looking at large swaths of people. Go ahead.
Yeah, so one thing to know about it is you can't run a batch check. So you can't have a list of people. So I think that this list of people are potentially non-citizens, and you can't just kind of run a batch comparison. They have to be 1-by-1 checks. And SAVE, we call it a database. It's not actually even a database. It's more like a compilation of databases. And so what happens is there's actually a query run to that system every time you're checking a person. So it's a really 1-by-1 process. You also have to have a unique identifier for that person. So in some cases, Georgia, for instance, uses it actually pretty effectively. One of the reasons that they do is because they collect on their registration forms, they collect an alien verification number. And that number can be used to run a SAVE check. If you don't have something like that, some unique identifier, then it's really difficult to even run that check. And again, you can't do it in batch. So it's really like, if you have the suspicion that one person is a non-citizen, you may be able to check. It's also a point in time check. So again, that person may be in the process of being naturalized. They may have already been naturalized. So you're really only getting information on them at that one point in time as well. And you did mention the federal SAVE Act as well. So that is being actively considered in Congress right now. That would require documentary proof of citizenship across the country for federal elections. So that would kind of change how this is being done, and states would really have to adapt and figure out how to conduct this signature or this citizenship verification if that was something that would become law. And it is being actively considered. It is possible that we would see that this year.
Thank you.
On the topic of counting ballots, I always like to sort of, historically, this is actually a really interesting map, but I think it's interesting now too. So this is election day voting equipment in 2024. So one thing to note here is the amount of green. In most parts of the country at this point, we have paper ballots, and those are hand-marked paper ballots, but they are being tabulated, so they're being counted by an optical scan voting machine. So those ballots are being submitted through the machine, and they're being tabulated that way. So there aren't very many places that hand count, and I'll show that in a minute. There are a variety of other types of systems though, and Ohio is one of those that varies by county. So there are different types of systems that are used. But when people talk about sort of the security of the systems, one thing I always like to point out is that they are paper ballots. And in most cases, you can go back and look at that paper. So if you did think something was happening with the machines, if there were, some glitch, if there was some discrepancy, if there was a hacking incident, you've got the paper ballots to go back and look at in those situations. And that's true almost everywhere.
Including Ohio.
Including Ohio. And so part of the reason that this issue has come up a little bit is there have been some movements in some places to go back to hand counting paper ballots. I joked with the election officials, and I will with you all too, because I know many of you probably have been poll workers or election officials in one way, shape, or another. It's really difficult to hand count. It's not all that accurate. And in most cases where we see hand counting actually occurring are very, very small jurisdictions. So I like to use, again, my home state of Colorado. There's one little blue spot in there. So there's one county that hand counts. That is the smallest county in the state. They've got about 500 full-time residents, if that. They don't even have a stoplight. And so in that case, it makes sense to hand count. It may not make sense to get a machine. I will also say that I heard recently from the state election director that they did actually get a tabulation machine finally. So they're not even still hand counting. But most of these places that are in blue are very, very small jurisdictions, not a lot of registered voters. It is possible to hand count in some situations like that. Larger jurisdictions, it's usually very, very difficult just because it's not reliable, it's time consuming, it's resource consuming. And again, most of these places do have tabulators that can very quickly count those ballots. And you've always got the paper if you need it.
And I just want to jump in here. We've had a couple boards of elections do hand count studies. And what they found is they take a lot of time and the accuracy rate is much worse. And so this is where we want to talk about the importance of post-election audits, because that's where, and remember that the league was the first to support and actually secure post-election audits. It was through litigation after the 2004 elections, and now that's law, which is great. But the idea is that we're comparing the digital record of a vote and the paper record of a vote, right? A statistical significant sample. If there are problems, then we could compare a larger batch and a larger batch and a larger batch and potentially count every single ballot if needed. So if you hear someone talking about hand counted ballots, we need to help them understand that we can do that if we need to in Ohio, but that it's extremely expensive. It's extremely time consuming, but not necessarily more accurate. And that our audits are continue to be 99% plus accurate. Anything else you want to say about that, Katie?
I think that was pretty accurate. So in terms of that, we have been seeing legislation on this topic. It's been introduced in a lot of states, although we haven't seen it passing for the most part. The one exception to that was Arkansas in 2023 did pass something that allowed counties to opt for a hand count after the machine count. But to that point, it's almost like conducting a full audit. So they were still required to go through the machine, but then they did a full hand count after. And there were a couple of counties that chose to do this past year. They did find that the machine count was accurate in those cases, but they were permitted to do that full hand count afterwards if they wanted. The advantage of an audit, excuse me, is that it typically just chooses a percentage of the ballots or of the precincts to audit. And some of the sort of best audits out there are statistically significant. So you can look at a set number of ballots or a certain percentage of ballots and have confidence then that the machine is counting them accurately. But again, this has been an issue in a number of states. We've seen legislation in the last few years in at least 14 states that would require some sort of hand counting. Ranked choice voting, I know, is also something that's been considered in Ohio, or kind of both directions. So this was one of those slow building trends over quite a number of years where there were states here and there that were permitting it. Something that we've seen recently, really just in the past couple of years, is actively prohibiting ranked choice voting as an option. So currently there are just 2 states that use ranked choice voting in statewide elections. Those are Alaska and Maine. Alaska had a measure this past year to potentially move away from using ranked choice voting. That did not pass, and so they still have ranked choice voting, but there will likely be another measure in the next couple of years to try to kind of pull that back a little bit. But currently those are the 2 states that have it in statewide elections. And then those other states in gold permit it typically for localities. So you've got a lot of sort of municipal ranked choice voting elections in those states. And they permit counties or municipalities to opt into that in most cases. So those aren't conducted statewide. And then those in red are the ones that actively prohibit its use in their states at the moment.
And then Katie, would you jump in here and talk about, we heard some feedback at OAEO, right, about concerns with ranked choice voting. So I'm wondering if you hear that from elections officials in other places and what that concern is.
From an administrative point of view, I think part of the concern is how they're actually being counted and the ability to do that again, because we use a variety of different machines throughout the country. There's not necessarily standard machines within a state. And so if there is ranked choice voting, some of the concern that I hear sometimes is, can our machines handle that? In some cases, I think maybe, but I think it's a case by case thing as well. In some cases, I've heard that vendors charge a little bit more for that feature. So that's one sort of very administrative aspect of it. I've also heard the sort of education angle, so educating voters about how that works. And there's some concern from election officials on what they have to do in terms of creating an education campaign about how the system works. And then there's also some concern that I hear sometimes about conducting post-election audits using ranked choice voting, just because it complicates that whole process. So there's sort of these administrative angles of it just makes the whole thing a little bit more complicated. And so sometimes you hear a little bit of hesitation on the part of election officials because it's kind of adding one more layer of complexity. Okay. And one of the biggest trends we've seen just since 2020 is protections for election workers. You've probably heard that there have been quite a few instances of threats to election workers in one shape or another, particularly those that run the elections, so the Board of Elections or the county clerks, but also just the regular poll workers in some cases. And so we've seen legislation across the country specifically protecting election workers. So criminalizing intimidation, allowing election worker addresses to be confidential so that they're not subject to, protests outside their house, or doxing, which is kind of, or swatting, which is kind of, doxing is telling their address to somebody else with the intent to intimidate. Swatting is something like calling police to an election official's office or home residence, and specifically, again, kind of intending to harass or intimidate. So a lot of those bills protecting election officials and very explicitly protecting election officials have passed since 2020. I do like to point out, though, that a lot of states had this on the books in one shape or another before 2020, partly because this is not the first time in our history, unfortunately, where election officials have come under threat. So it's certainly been a trend, but there were also a lot of states that already had something on the books about it.
Okay, and then we have gray means there's nothing on the books. Is that what gray means?
Yes. Yeah, that means that we did not find anything in statute. Yeah.
Okay. And there are efforts to strengthen this in Ohio, and this might be a spot that we work with the elections officials on. So stay tuned on that. Keep going.
Great. Well, so just to talk about a few more things that I didn't mention that we've been seeing in election legislation. One thing is the speed of election results. You may have seen this a bit. I think it's kind of funny that we've come full circle, but people talk about Florida. So they talk about we want the Florida model because Florida has been very fast in reporting results in recent years. And of course, for a long, long time after the 2000 election, Florida was the one that we all pointed to and said, oh, we don't want to be like Florida. And now people are wanting to be like Florida. But part of that is some of their system is set up so that they can very quickly report election results. So we've been seeing some bills wanting to move states a little bit towards that in one way or another. A lot of that is adjusting some of the deadlines. Some of it is equipment based, honestly. Some of it is about processing absentee or mailed ballots ahead of time. And some of it is also sort of when results are required to be reported and what canvassing and certification deadlines look like. So there's a lot of things that go into that, but that is something we've been seeing quite a bit of. Another thing that's been, I feel like just kind of a slow moving sort of trend every few years is consolidating election dates. So what that is moving local elections or school board elections to coincide with state or federal elections, with the idea being that those federal elections, those every 2 years, November, are often higher turnout affairs. And so maybe it's beneficial for localities or school boards to move their ballot measures and candidates and that sort of thing to be under those same types of elections. So that's kind of a slow moving trend to some extent. And then also some legislation on filling vacancies. So this is related to if there's a vacancy in an office, whether it's a death, a resignation, maybe someone appointed to a higher office, how are those vacancies filled? Are they filled by appointment? Are they filled by special election? What are the timeframes for holding that special election? So this is another area that we've just seen some recent legislation on. And with that, I'll just note a couple of things that we have resources on a wide variety of things. So I focused on what Ohio has been considering in the past, I know, but we have a wide variety of other things as well. So if there's ever anything you're interested in, we post most things publicly, and so it is available for anyone. If there's something you don't see there, it may be a little bit trickier. We typically are only available to do research for constituents, which are legislatures. But if we have something in the background that you don't see publicly, feel free to ask me. And if I am able to share it, I certainly will. And I'll also just post my information there. And with that, thank you for having me. And I don't know if there's any other questions, Jen.
Yeah, there are some. One is, have there been studies to determine the extent that requiring proof of citizenship has potentially suppressed or discouraged voting and registration among folks who are actually eligible to vote?
So that's a little tricky. It's a little early, to be honest. So Arizona has had it for a while, and so there are some studies coming specifically out of Arizona. Kansas is the one that did it right after Arizona, and that actually made its way through the courts, and so is not actively being enforced. And I should have said too that it's very likely that as these pass in states, they will be challenged in court. Exactly for that sort of reasoning is that are we targeting people who would otherwise be eligible to vote and they just don't happen to have their birth certificate? There are starting to be some studies, because this has been a thing this year, about the number of people that maybe don't have something to prove their citizenship. So these are people that are citizens, but maybe they don't have their birth certificate because they were born in a rural area where they weren't given a birth certificate right off the bat. Maybe they were born on a US military base to American parents. They are US citizens, but they weren't provided with a birth certificate at that point. There are some people born on Native American reservations, for example, where they may not have that proof of US birth certificate as well. So there are starting to be some studies about how large of the population we may be talking about here. And I think states that are considering that should look at their state populations as well and try to identify how many people may have some difficulty showing this in some way, shape, or form.
Great. And then just a reminder to everyone that Ohio has one of the strictest photo IDs in the country, and that birth certificates do not work, but that might be a backing document that someone needs for them in order for them to get a qualifying photo ID. And Vote Writers is an organization that we partner a lot with who can help people not just get their driver's license or state ID or passport, book or card, but also get their birth certificate so that they can get those. So vote riders is something we'll be continuing to talk about through the voter services. Are there requirements for live reporting after polls close? Or do some states have those?
So there are some states that sort of require certain intervals of reporting. In terms of live reporting, that's a little tricky because so there's a confidence aspect of this too. So if people kind of see those numbers, and they can be going up and down in some cases, just as things are being processed. So there's a kind of a balance to be struck there between the transparency of showing results periodically and still maintaining confidence that things are changing kind of constantly. They're counting provisional ballots, they're processing absentee ballots. So things change frequently, but there are a number of states that have, I don't know, you have to report right when the polls close, for example, and then you've got to report 2 hours later, and then you've got to report at midnight, and then you have to report maybe 2 days later. So there are some states that set certain intervals of reporting. But it also should be noted that that's always all unofficial, and that it's, there's the canvassing period and then certification. Results aren't actually official until certification is complete, which ranges anywhere from a week to a month after Election Day.
Thank you for that. So overall, are provisional ballots increasing? Have you seen a rise in provisional ballots? I have an answer for Ohio, but I want to know what you have to say, Katie.
I'm not actually sure. I do know of some political scientists that have studied that. I don't know off the top of my head. I would anticipate no, actually. But I don't know that I can say that with confidence.
So in Ohio, what we're actually most concerned about is that a lot of folks are not curing their provisional ballots. And so we do have a research that we'll be releasing soon on how people voted and what challenges they may or may not had, and we'll have stats on there about provisional balloting. So Michael, stay tuned. The number one and number two reason, and I'm not sure which is which, I believe it's actually not being registered is our number one reason for provisionals. And the second is ID, but those might be flipped. It depends each year. Great. And I did just, Vashita Johnson is on with Vote Riders. And so she said there, thanks, Jen. So if anyone wants to get connected with Vote Riders, let us know and we will get you connected. Hillary is asking about passports being expensive, how does showing US citizenship work with not having to pay to vote? So, I mean, first off, you can use a green card, which you're going to need anyway. But I don't know, have you gotten a question like that before in terms of, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's actually, I don't remember what percentage of the country has passports, but it's certainly not everybody. But just like with the voter ID requirement, where there's various IDs that are accepted, even with the documentary proof of citizenship, there are a list of acceptable ways to show that verification. So a birth certificate is one, a passport could be another one. So there's usually sort of a wide variety of things that you can provide to show it. But again, in some cases, it may be difficult to get your birth certificate just because of one reason or another. So it is a possible barrier, yeah.
And, this is one of those, we'll talk about this again when Census 2030 comes. There are folks that, as Katie was saying, don't have a birth certificate because they grew up in they were born in a very rural area. They weren't even born at a hospital, all kinds of things. Or sometimes the fact that the family's on the census rolls becomes part of that proof, but that gets super complicated. But we'll mention that when we get closer to educating about that. One reminder I have for everyone is that state IDs in Ohio are now free, as long as you have those backing documents. And if you are not a citizen, for whether you have a driver's license or a state ID, it'll be marked that you're not a citizen, that's a new law. And then those folks, once they are naturalized, can go back and get one without that demarcation on there for free. And we need folks to make sure they do that. It's a very new law here in Ohio. How many states do that? Put something on a driver's license that says, or a state ID, that folks are not citizens.
So we're starting to see a lot more of that. I don't know off the top of my head how many do, but a number do, or there's some sort of designation in one shape or another. I know a couple of states, it was Wyoming, just passed something that said you have to have in red non-citizen on that ID. There are also some where a citizen, so often if you're legally in the country, but you're not a citizen, you can often get a driver's license, but they may look different. So there's a variety of different ways of kind of determining if this is a citizen ID versus a non-citizen ID.
Thank you for that. We do have legislation that is starting to move. But before we get there, Elizabeth, would you just, since it is Take Action Tuesday, would you please just talk about our action alert that we have for today? And Katie will be back in 1 second. I'm gonna explain this legislation that's moving right now.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I just put it in the chat, but really, we just want to take this opportunity as the Ohio House has begun to work on Ohio's main budget to remind them that election workers deserve to be safe, have great training, and to be fairly compensated. So this is something that we will probably say more than once over the next few months, but we wanted to get it started. So this is going to your House member, and it will just say exactly that: support our election workers.
Yeah, I mean, their jobs keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but their budgets have not. And we know that, you know, they always say, our elections officials friends say it takes three things to run elections: people, time, and money. And so it's incredibly important. So in the transportation budget right now, and Katie, I'll explain what we see the provisions are, and then you can kind of react about like how this might line up with other states. I'm still analyzing this legislation, but within the transportation budget, there is about 16 pages dealing with voting. It would mean that the BMV can only offer voter registration forms if the person has provided the BMV with citizenship proof. It's instructing the Secretary of State to have a monthly report that they compile of individuals who have surrendered their Ohio driver's license or SID. And I need to understand what the term surrendered means here, Katie, but it is in quotation surrendered or has been expired in the last 6 months. This report would then go to the boards of elections, and they would be marked as having to cast a provisional ballot unless they've updated their voter registration, and instructs the Board of Elections to cancel registrations of people who voted provisionally because they were on that monthly report, but did not come cure their provisional ballot. So there's a lot in there. It's a lot of new processes. I have some concerns on folks getting wrapped up into this that shouldn't, but just wanted to know if you wanted to comment on that, Katie. Obviously, you haven't seen the legislation, but in big picture.
Yeah, well, the one thing that comes to mind is I touched a little bit about list maintenance. And so one thing that I have seen states do is typically when a driver's license is issued to somebody who's not a citizen, it has a shorter expiration period. So, you know, if you or I as citizens get our driver's license, it may be good for 10 years. Somebody who's legally in the country who's getting a non-citizen driver's license, it may be only good for a year. So one thing I have seen is that comparison of that data. So how many of those driver's licenses have expired, and then flagging those people potentially as either maybe they became citizens. And so we need to know if they inadvertently ended up on the rolls, maybe they're okay to be on the rolls because they've become citizens, or maybe we need to identify those people as potentially non-citizens that should be removed at some point.
And here in Ohio, it's 4 years for everybody. So thank you for that. Other pieces surrendered. I'm wondering if surrendered means maybe they've lost their license. I mean, this concerns me simply because a lot of people have their licenses taken away for like not paying a traffic ticket, not paying child support. Of course, we want people to pay their traffic tickets and their child support, but taking it away for things that are not really related to moving violation, you know, like accident or things like that. So I'm assuming that's what that means, Katie, but it's okay if you don't have thought on that. So just so everyone knows, the transportation budget is the first of 3 that go through the process. And so that's moving now, and we'll be doing, I'm sure next week's Take Action Tuesday will be on that. We'll have testimony and things on that as well. I have a question for you, Katie, as we wrap up. So the league, we've got this 105-year history of advocating for voters and both in terms of access, but also security and integrity, and we're very proud of that history. What advice would you give advocates on being effective in terms of election policy advocacy?
Yeah, it's tough. So NCSL, so we don't advocate for particular policy points.
Yeah.
We provide sort of that information piece of it. So I guess the biggest thing that I'd say is that the educational and information piece is really useful. And I know that the league provides a lot of that through like studies, as you were mentioning. So I would say engage legislators and engage them kind of directly as often as you can. I always like to point out that sometimes session is not actually the best time to engage them, just because they are so busy and they're being pulled in a million different directions. So really kind of establishing those relationships outside of session. So in the interim and maybe in the home districts where they can give you a little bit more attention. If they know you and they kind of know that you've helped them in the past, especially in kind of an informational way, then they're much more likely to sort of be receptive if you have something that you say, hey, I'd like to see this a little bit different, or have you thought about this angle? So really establishing those relationships.
I think that's really great. Thank you for that. And I think part of what you mean for education is helping lawmakers understand how the election administration process works, which is very different than casting a ballot. That's very different than running a campaign, right? Is that what you meant? Is kind of like,
Yeah.
I think that's great. So one of the things that we will do is we'll make sure that all of our local leagues have our report kind of on elections trends, and maybe a couple things that you might want to drop by in district meeting with your state rep and state senator about what we found there. That would be a great next step. Any other questions or comments? I've got 3 in the thing here. Open, sorry. Please cover again what is acceptable ID. Would you please, someone put that in the text. We do have, Elizabeth has set up a really great how to vote webpage. What about a marriage license to prove name change from that on your birth certificate? Carol Benton, I think that especially if you're doing like trying to get a DMV, a Bureau of Motor Vehicles, a license or state ID, or you're trying to get a passport, you need to look at what those agencies accept as proof of name change. So this isn't what the Board of Elections accepts. It's like you would either have to go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles here in Ohio or the federal government for passports to know what they accept. Okay, I think those are the last 2. Thank you so much for joining us, and I thought it was really informative. I think our guests definitely enjoyed it. And any final words for us, Ms. Katie?
No, thank you for having me. And I should have mentioned I have been a member of the league at times, and I appreciate what you all do and informing people. And yeah, it's great to have you as part of the civic organizations around voting. Voting's so important.
And is it okay if we send the slides to people who ask for it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. And also, friends, we'll have this on YouTube. And Katie, you're wonderful. Thank you. We appreciate you.
No, thanks so much for having me.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.